Have you ever carried the survival of an entire corporation on your shoulders, only to be treated like an inanimate piece of furniture in corporate America? The quietest people usually hold the grenade pin. For 6 years, I cleaned up catastrophic messes left by privileged executives. Then, one public insult finally woke the monster inside me. I did not cry or argue. I just smiled and sent a 5-word email that burned their entire empire to the ground. Hello, dear listeners of Boss Revenge Stories, and thank you so much for your continued support. Unfortunately, YouTube has recently disabled our monetization, leaving us without the budget to operate, which means we will not be uploading new videos here in the foreseeable future and are moving our operations to Patreon. If you enjoyed today's story, please consider supporting us by joining our Patreon community, where you will find even better, longer, and more detailed, exclusive true stories featuring multiple emotional voice actors. You can join by simply scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the Patreon link in the description or the comments section below. Now, let us dive into today's story, told from the perspective of our protagonist, Savannah Allen. I am 34 years old, and for 6 grueling years, I served as the Risk Compliance Manager at Apex Meridian Capital, to the outside world, reading the glossy financial magazines. Apex Meridian was an untouchable titan of green energy infrastructure investment, standing tall in the heart of Chicago. To me, working deep within its bureaucratic bowels, it was a beautifully painted ship with a hull made of rotting wood, constantly taking on water. My job title sounded authoritative on paper, but in reality, I was the invisible architect holding the crumbling walls together. I was the one who quietly sat in the shadows of the open-plan office, bathed in the blue light of my monitors long after the elevators had shut down. I was responsible for rewriting 90% of the complex financial models because the golden boys of the firm could not be bothered to read the fine print or understand the intricate compliance laws. I made sure our ambitious, heavily leveraged projects did not violate stringent federal laws. I built the safety nets that stopped these reckless men from destroying the firm. Yet, whenever a monumental deal successfully closed, it was never me standing at the mahogany podium, the people receiving the roaring applause, the firm handshakes, and the massive 6-figure bonuses were always the male directors parading around in custom Italian suits. They eagerly took the credit for the bulletproof contracts I had meticulously drafted while they were busy clinking Scotch glasses at expensive steakhouses downtown. The tipping point, the exact moment the scales fell from my eyes, involved a man named Bryce Sterling. Bryce was a recent addition to the high-level strategy team, a textbook nepotism hire whose primary qualification was the elite country club his father belonged to. He possessed the unearned confidence of a seasoned Wall Street veteran and the actual competence of an intern on their first day of orientation. Last month, Bryce was handed the responsibility of finalizing a critical solar energy tax credit agreement. It was a massive, highly publicized deal, worth tens of millions of dollars, but Bryce, in his absolute rush to leave the office for a Friday evening golf retreat, made a catastrophic, foundational typo in the core tax schedule of the agreement. It was not just a simple clerical error or a misplaced comma. It was a profound structural violation that would have immediately triggered a devastating audit and a crushing financial penalty from the Internal Revenue Service, potentially tanking the entire quarter for the firm. I caught the fatal error at 2 a.m. on a Saturday. My eyes were burning from staring at the dual monitors in my silent, dark apartment. I sat back in my chair and stared at the glowing red flag on the screen. I could have let it burn. I could have closed my laptop, gone to sleep, and let the internal compliance alarm bells ring out loud on Monday morning. But the deeply ingrained habit of being the company's reliable, silent shield took over my better judgment. I dragged myself to the kitchen, brewed another strong pot of black coffee, opened the encrypted servers, and spent the next 6 unbroken hours silently rewriting the entire structure of the contract. I meticulously recalibrated the tax compliance clauses, sealed the glaring legal loopholes Bryce had blindly created, and uploaded the pristine, legally sound document back into the executive folder just before the sun came up over the Chicago skyline. I saved the company millions of dollars. I saved Bryce's fledgling career from being destroyed before it even began. And I did it entirely off the record. Absolutely no one knew how perilously close they had come to a total, unmitigated disaster. I walked into the bustling Chicago office on Monday morning, physically exhausted, but expecting at least a modicum of internal relief. Perhaps a quiet, private acknowledgement from the upper management who monitored the system logs. Instead, what I witnessed was a masterclass in corporate delusion. At the 10 o'clock morning executive briefing, Bryce stood at the head of the long glass conference table, grinning from ear to ear. The board of directors gave him a literal pat on the back, praising his excellent acumen and his sharp eye for structuring complex tax incentives. He absorbed the unearned praise like a sponge, nodding humbly and smiling as if he had actually spent his weekend doing the grueling analytical work. I sat quietly at the far end of the room, sipping my lukewarm water, waiting for a simple nod, a glance of recognition, anything at all. Instead, my phone buzzed violently against the glass table. It was an internal email from Bryce. The message did not contain a single word of gratitude or a technical question about the finalized financial model. It simply asked if I could make sure the premium roast coffee was freshly brewed and set up in conference room B for his upcoming client meeting at noon. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone, the words burning into my retinas. In that quiet, sterile conference room, the grand illusion finally shattered into 1,000 pieces. I realized with absolute, horrifying clarity that my excellence, my sleepless late nights, and my unwavering dedication were not viewed as talent. They were not seen as leadership material or stepping stones to a future partnership. To the elite boys club of Apex Meridian Capital, my competence was merely a given. I was perceived as a free public utility, a silent, automated safety mechanism designed to endlessly absorb their failures and polish their unearned successes. They did not respect me. They simply expected me. And that was the exact moment I realized I had to stop protecting them. The atmosphere inside the grand boardroom on the 50th floor was thick with the scent of expensive leather and misplaced arrogance. Eleanor Vance, the chief financial officer of our firm, stood at the head of the impossibly long mahogany table. Eleanor was a ruthless, sharply contoured woman who viewed corporate finance not as a science of numbers and laws, but as a theatrical performance. She valued flashy presentations, aggressive posturing, and endless expansion far more than actual, foundational competence. She had summoned the entire executive roster, pulling over 50 senior staff members away from their desks, to make a grand, company-wide announcement. As I sat near the back, perfectly silent and observant, Eleanor beamed with predatory pride. She leaned into the microphone and officially announced that Bryce Sterling was being promoted to the coveted position of Director of Strategy. The room erupted into polite, practiced applause. I watched the golden boy, who had nearly cost us everything just days prior, step forward to bathe in the unearned glory. But the promotion was only the appetizer. The main event was Bryce defending his grand investment roadmap for Q3. Bryce confidently tapped his wireless remote, bringing up a dazzling array of slides detailing an aggressive new initiative for a massive offshore wind power project. He spoke with the slick, practiced cadence of a television salesman, outlining a rapid expansion strategy that involved aggressively buying out regional grid access and forcing out smaller competitors through exclusive supply chain lockouts. He painted a picture of unprecedented market dominance and record-breaking profits for the upcoming fiscal year. I listened carefully, my eyes scanning the fine print of the projected contracts flashing on the massive screens. The air in my lungs suddenly felt very thin. It was not just an ambitious plan, it was a blatant, highly illegal roadmap to a monopoly. The strategy he was pitching directly and severely violated core federal antitrust regulations. The mechanism he was proposing to control the regional energy grid was so brazenly aggressive that if it ever crossed the desk of a federal regulator, it would not just invite a financial penalty, it would trigger an immediate, catastrophic asset freeze. every single dollar tied to the wind power project, and likely the firm's broader operational accounts, would be locked down by the government overnight. I waited for a natural pause in his presentation when Bryce stopped to take a sip of sparkling water. I gently raised my hand. I did not want to embarrass him. I merely wanted to do the exact job I was hired to do. I spoke in a calm, measured, and entirely professional tone. Excuse me, Bryce, regarding the supply chain exclusivity clauses on slide 14, if we apply this specific market capture model, we will directly trigger an antitrust investigation. The legal loophole you are relying on to bypass the grid regulations was actually closed by federal mandate last year. If we proceed with this exact structure, we risk having the firm's operating assets frozen the moment the initial contracts are filed. I expected a nod of realization, or perhaps a request to review the legal parameters offline. Instead, a sharp, aggressive noise pierced the room. Eleanor smacked her perfectly manicured hand flat against the heavy wooden table. She clicked her tongue loudly, tilting her head back and rolling her eyes with such exaggerated, theatrical annoyance that the gesture felt like a physical strike. She glared at me from across the expanse of the room, her lips curling into a cruel, mocking smile. She did not bother to lower her voice. She wanted every single one of the 50 executives in the room to hear her clearly. Savannah, we do not pay you to ruin this positive atmosphere. Just sit there and be a pretty Decor, Eleanor snarled, her voice dripping with sheer venom and condescension. The entire boardroom instantly plunged into a dead, suffocating silence. The air grew incredibly heavy, pressing down on my shoulders like a physical weight. You could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning unit vibrating in the ceiling, punctuated only by the shallow, nervous breathing of the men sitting nearest to me. Over 50 highly educated, incredibly wealthy professionals sat frozen in their oversized leather chairs. A few pairs of eyes darted toward me, flashing brief, cowardly moments of sympathetic pity, before immediately looking down at their expensive notebooks. Absolutely no one opened their mouth. Not a single person in that room, many of whom I had personally saved from regulatory ruin over the past 6 years, had the basic human decency to stand up and defend me. They all chose their lucrative salaries over my dignity. In that deafening silence, I felt a profound, fundamental shift deep within my chest. I did not blush. My hands did not shake. I did not cry. Nor did I feel the desperate, humiliating urge to argue or justify my existence to a room full of cowards. The simmering resentment I had carried for years instantly crystallized into pure, freezing ice. I looked directly into Eleanor's mocking eyes. I did not break eye contact as I offered her a soft, perfectly polite smile. I reached out, grasped the edge of my laptop, and slowly pulled it down. The screen met the keyboard with a sharp, dry click that echoed clearly through the silent room. In that single quiet moment, my role as their invisible protector officially ended. I decided right then and there that Apex Meridian Capital had outlived its usefulness, and it was finally time for them to pay the ultimate price. Most people imagine a grand heist involving men in black tactical gear dropping from the ceiling, shattering laser grids, and cracking titanium vaults to steal millions of dollars in unmarked bills or flawless diamonds. But in the modern corporate world, the most devastating heists do not involve stealing physical assets. They involve stealing safety. When I walked back to my desk after being publicly humiliated and reduced to a piece of pretty decor, I did not harbor thoughts of screaming, quitting, or filing a grievance with human resources. Instead, I sat down in my ergonomic chair, adjusted my monitors, and began orchestrating the most methodical, invisible reverse heist in the history of Apex Meridian Capital. I was not going to break into their system to steal their money. I was going to quietly dismantle their security architecture and let them destroy themselves. I was going to pull the life support plug. For half a decade, I had operated as a silent, omnipresent safety net. The firm utilized an incredibly complex, proprietary risk management software that we internally called the Argus Matrix. It was a centralized digital nervous system that monitored every single transaction, contract, and proposal that flowed through the company. When I was first hired, I had secretly programmed my own administrative account with a customized protocol labeled Priority Manual Review. This meant that any deal crossing a threshold of $10 million, or involving federal tax credits, was automatically intercepted by the software and routed into my hidden queue. The executives never knew this bottleneck existed. They simply thought our legal department was incredibly fast. In reality, I was manually catching their catastrophic errors, quietly rewriting their clauses in the dead of night, and pushing the corrected documents forward before anyone could notice. It was time to take that invisible shield away. I opened the master administrative dashboard of the Argus Matrix. The screen bathed my face in a pale, cold light. The office around me was buzzing with the sounds of junior analysts shouting over the phones and the heavy thud of leather shoes on the hardwood floors. Completely oblivious to what was happening in my quiet corner, I navigated through 12 layers of encrypted security menus until I reached the global routing configurations. I hovered my cursor over my custom priority manual review setting. With a single, deliberate click of my mouse, I downgraded the entire corporate safety net to standard processing. I hit the Enter key to confirm the command. A small green bar flashed across the top of my screen, signaling that the update was live. Just like that, the safety net evaporated. Standard processing was a bare-bones, factory default setting. It meant the automated software would only scan documents for rudimentary formatting errors, like missing dates or unsigned signature blocks. It would completely and utterly ignore complex, nuanced violations of federal financial law. I had just opened the floodgates, allowing their raw, unedited arrogance to flow directly into the real world. It did not take long for the first disaster to present itself. Emboldened by his flashy new title as Director of Strategy, Bryce Sterling was moving at a breakneck pace to solidify his dominance. Less than 48 hours after my system downgrade, Bryce rushed to finalize the monumental government subsidy contract for his pet offshore wind turbine project. He was desperate to impress the board of directors before the end of the third quarter, to guarantee a massive influx of capital from our most aggressive institutional investors. Bryce promised them an astronomical, guaranteed interest rate on their returns. There was just one glaring, fatal flaw in his brilliant strategy: structuring a profit margin that high on a taxpayer-funded, federally subsidized green energy initiative directly violated the core anti-profiteering mandate set forth by the Federal Trade Commission. The law was crystal clear: you cannot leverage government climate subsidies to artificially inflate private investor payouts beyond a strict baseline limit of 7%. Bryce, in his infinite, untested wisdom, had structured the payouts at a staggering 15%. He was essentially drafting a legally binding confession of federal financial fraud, planning to siphon taxpayer money directly into the pockets of our wealthiest clients. It was the kind of violation that did not just result in a slap on the wrist. It resulted in multi-million-dollar fines and potential criminal indictments for the executives involved. Normally, this exact contract would have been intercepted by my priority manual review. The Argus Matrix would have flagged the interest rate discrepancy, and the document would have landed squarely on my desktop. I would have spent 5 hours frantically redlining the document, highlighting the Federal Trade Commission violations in bright red digital ink, and marching down to Bryce's corner office to force him to restructure the debt hierarchy before the government auditors ever saw a single page. This time, the notification popped up in my standard queue just like any other mundane piece of daily paperwork. It was a massive, 200-page digital document. I opened it and casually scrolled down to page 73, where the predatory interest clauses were sitting, glaringly obvious to anyone who actually bothered to study federal compliance law. My index finger rested lightly on my mouse. I felt a strange, profound sense of peace wash over me. I did not reach for my desktop phone to call Eleanor. I did not open my editing software to fix Bryce's mess. Instead, I moved the cursor to the bottom right corner of the screen. I hovered over a button I had never once clicked in my 6 years at Apex Meridian. The button read, Preliminary Approval as submitted by Director of Strategy. I clicked it. The system chimed softly, processing the command and officially pushing the fraudulent contract out of my department and straight toward final execution. However, before I closed the window entirely, I utilized an external capture tool to take highly detailed, time-stamped screenshots of the original submission, Bryce's digital signature authorizing the exact terms, and my specific system-logged approval parameters. I neatly packaged this explosive evidence and saved it directly to an encrypted, offline flash drive hidden deep inside my purse. With the primary trap perfectly set, I needed to ensure that no one could rely on my past labor to save them when the walls finally started closing in. I initiated a ruthless, untraceable digital scrubbing campaign across the entire company network. Over my tenure, I had authored hundreds of custom risk management playbooks, intricate legal cheat sheets, and complex compliance algorithms designed to navigate the darkest gray areas of federal tax codes. They were stored on the centralized corporate cloud server, acting as a secret, sacred library of salvation that the junior staff frequently relied upon when they were confused. File by file, folder by folder, I permanently migrated everything off the company network. I transferred every ounce of my intellectual property onto my private servers. I did not outright delete the main folders, as that would trigger an immediate IT security alert. Instead, I meticulously hollowed them out from the inside. I replaced my brilliant, cutting-edge legal algorithms with outdated, 10-year-old standard-issue corporate templates filled with useless, generic jargon. If Eleanor or her panicked legal team ever came looking for my master guides on navigating antitrust loopholes, they would find absolutely nothing but empty digital rooms and useless corporate buzzwords. I erased my ghost from the machine. To the outside world, and especially in the eyes of the executive board, Apex Meridian Capital continued to operate flawlessly. The massive wind turbine contracts were signed and celebrated with lavish catered lunches. The millions of dollars began to flow into the designated escrow accounts. Eleanor was already loudly discussing the multi-million-dollar performance bonuses she expected to receive at the end of the year. Bryce walked around the office with the swagger of a conquering king, completely unaware that the empire he thought he was building was entirely made of paper and gasoline. They thought they were dominating the financial sector. They had absolutely no idea that they were sitting in the back seat of a billion-dollar supercar, accelerating blindly at 200 miles per hour straight toward a jagged, bottomless cliff, entirely unaware that the pretty Decor in the compliance department had quietly reached under the chassis and severed the brake lines. The final day of the fiscal year at a major financial institution is always a pressure cooker, a frantic race against the clock where billions of dollars change hands before the markets officially close. For Apex Meridian Capital, the survival of the fourth quarter rested entirely on the massive disbursement of funds for the offshore wind turbine project. The capital had to flow from our institutional escrow accounts into the operational holding accounts by 5 p.m, or the entire quarter would end in a disastrous deficit. At exactly 2 hours past noon, the tension in the executive suite morphed into absolute panic. The external, independent compliance software, a secondary firewall mandated by our partner banks that operated entirely outside of the system I had already compromised, suddenly violently rejected the wire transfer. The software threw up a massive, uncompromising red alert right across the central financial dashboard. It had automatically scanned the final disbursement requisition and detected the glaring, radioactive anomalies regarding the promised investor interest rates. The system recognized the numbers as a direct, undeniable violation of the Federal Trade Commission anti-profiteering mandates. It immediately engaged an automated emergency protocol, freezing every single cent tied to the wind project. Up in the glass-walled offices of the 50th floor, Eleanor Vance was practically hyperventilating. Her entire professional identity, and more importantly, her massive, heavily leveraged lifestyle, depended on that quarterly report. If the wind project transaction collapsed on the very last day of the year, the firm would miss its projected growth targets by a staggering margin. The stock price would take a massive hit. the board of directors would demand immediate answers, and her guaranteed performance bonus of $2 million would instantly vanish into thin air. She could not let that happen. She needed someone to fix the system, to bypass the banking gateway, and to make the red alert disappear before the 5 o'clock deadline. Naturally, she demanded that her pretty Decor come clean up the mess. Her executive assistant frantically dialed my office extension, then my corporate cell phone, and finally my personal number, but they only received the cold, automated voice of my voicemail. At exactly 6 in the morning that very same day, I had logged into the Human Resources portal and submitted a request for exactly 1 day of paid sick leave, citing a severe migraine. I had completely powered down all my company devices and placed them in a locked drawer at my apartment. I was utterly and completely unreachable. With the clock mercilessly ticking down and her $2 million bonus slipping through her fingers, Eleanor made the exact desperate, arrogant calculation I knew she would make. She assumed the compliance alert was merely a software glitch, an overly sensitive digital hiccup that was getting in the way of her money. Driven by pure greed, she marched over to her terminal. She possessed the highest level of administrative clearance in the building, the Supreme Chief Financial Officer override credentials. She typed in her unique identification code, entered her secondary encrypted password, and deliberately ordered the system to forcefully bypass the federal red alert. She manually authorized the release of the fraudulent funds, explicitly commanding the software to ignore the Federal Trade Commission warnings. What Eleanor absolutely did not know, what no one at Apex Meridian Capital knew, was that 3 years prior, I had built a fail-safe mechanism deep within the core architecture of the firm's network. After watching executives repeatedly try to blame my department for their own reckless financial decisions, I had quietly coded and deployed an invisible shadow ledger. It was a completely decentralized, internal blockchain protocol that silently monitored the executive override functions. The beauty of blockchain technology is its absolute immutability. Once a transaction or an action is recorded onto the ledger, it is locked behind complex cryptography. It cannot be edited, it cannot be altered, and it absolutely cannot be deleted, not even by the person who created it. The exact second Eleanor pressed the enter key to bypass the federal warning, the shadow ledger woke up. It silently captured her specific login credentials, recorded the exact timestamp down to the millisecond, logged the specific geographic internet protocol address of her corner office computer, and took a permanent digital snapshot of the exact federal warning she was deliberately ignoring. It sealed all of this damning evidence into an unbreakable block of data. Meanwhile, completely oblivious to the fact that his boss had just committed a highly documented act of severe financial fraud to save his deeply flawed contract, Bryce Sterling was busy updating his social media profiles. Standing on the balcony of the executive lounge, he snapped a selfie holding a crystal glass of expensive champagne. He posted it to his professional network with a caption bragging about crushing the fourth quarter and revolutionizing the green energy sector. He was a clueless man cheerfully holding a lit match inside a room filled to the brim with dynamite. 10 blocks away from the suffocating anxiety of the corporate headquarters, I was sitting at a quiet, sunlit corner table in my favorite artisanal cafe. A smooth jazz track was playing softly from the overhead speakers. I lifted a porcelain cup of double espresso to my lips and took a slow, savoring sip. Resting on the table in front of me was my private, encrypted tablet. The screen was completely black, save for a single, small string of glowing green text that had just appeared in the center of the display. It was the confirmation code for my shadow ledger. The trap had flawlessly snapped shut. Eleanor had just placed her own head perfectly inside the noose, and all I had to do now was wait for the federal regulators to kick away the chair. Exactly 2 weeks passed in a state of eerie, manufactured tranquility. The executives were busy patting themselves on the back, counting their projected bonuses, and entirely oblivious to the monumental reckoning speeding toward them. Then, reality violently shattered their illusions. It began on a Tuesday morning, precisely 10 minutes after the opening bell rang on the New York Stock Exchange. There was absolutely no polite warning, no preliminary phone call from our banking partners, and no internal alert to soften the blow. The Securities and Exchange Commission, operating in a highly coordinated, devastating strike alongside federal banking auditors and investigators, executed a catastrophic administrative freeze on every single operational and holding account tied to Apex Meridian Capital. The news of the sudden freeze, coupled with leaked rumors of massive, systemic federal energy subsidy violations, hit the financial press before our internal public relations team even knew what was happening. The reaction from the market was instantaneous and absolutely merciless. Within the span of a single morning, our publicly traded stock price violently plunged by an astonishing 18%. Hundreds of millions of dollars in market capitalization evaporated into thin air in a matter of hours. Outside my office, the expansive open-plan trading floor transformed into an apocalyptic war zone. Junior analysts were screaming into their headsets. Senior partners were weeping openly while clutching their tablets. And the heavy glass doors of the main lobby were suddenly barricaded by federal agents wearing dark windbreakers, systematically confiscating hard drives and corporate ledgers. I sat in my small, glass-walled office, the absolute epicenter of the hurricane, representing the only island of perfect calm in a sea of corporate destruction. I was calmly sipping a cup of herbal tea and reviewing a mundane compliance newsletter when my door violently burst open. It slammed so forcefully against the rubber stopper that the glass panes rattled loudly in their aluminum frames. Eleanor Vance stormed into the room. The perfectly curated, fiercely arrogant mask of the untouchable chief financial officer had completely melted away, revealing nothing but a frantic, cornered, and deeply terrified animal. Her breathing was ragged and shallow. Her notoriously expensive designer suit was rumpled, and her face was flushed with a toxic, chaotic mixture of rage and sheer terror. She marched directly to my desk and slammed a massive, heavy stack of printed financial ledgers down onto the glass surface, sending a flurry of loose documents cascading onto the floor around my feet. "You need to fix this right now," Eleanor hissed, her voice trembling with barely suppressed hysteria. She leaned aggressively over my desk, planting her manicured hands firmly on the edge, attempting to use her physical presence to intimidate me. She frantically commanded me to immediately draft a retroactive, highly classified risk assessment report. Her desperate, wildly illegal plan was to completely falsify the internal network timeline. She wanted me to manipulate the compliance logs to make it look as though the third-party banking software had suffered a catastrophic technical malfunction on the final day of the quarter. She was ordering me to forge documents that would shift the entire blame onto a vendor glitch, thereby absolving her and the rest of the executive suite of any criminal liability for the frozen funds. I looked up at the frantic woman looming over my desk. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact, and I certainly did not reach for the fraudulent files she had thrown at me. "No," I said softly, my voice perfectly steady, entirely devoid of fear or subservience. "I will absolutely not commit document fraud to cover up your deliberate, manual circumvention of federal regulations, Eleanor." The color completely drained from her face for a fraction of a second, only to return immediately as a violently angry, deep red. Being denied by the woman she considered beneath her was the final spark that ignited her panic into pure rage. She erupted into a vicious, unhinged tirade. Pointing a trembling finger mere inches from my face, she began to scream. She threatened to fire me on the spot for gross negligence resulting in catastrophic financial damages to the firm. She promised to personally drag my name in front of the National Ethics and Disciplinary Board. She swore she would blacklist me so thoroughly that I would never find work in the financial sector anywhere in the United States ever again. As she continued to rant, she meticulously laid out her plan to make me the ultimate scapegoat, framing me as the incompetent compliance manager who had fallen asleep at the wheel and destroyed a billion-dollar empire. I let her talk. I let her expend all her terrified energy while I slowly turned my attention back to my glowing computer monitor. As her spit flew through the air and her voice cracked under the weight of her own impending doom, my mind briefly flashed back to that humiliating afternoon in the grand boardroom. I remembered the deafening silence of 50 executives watching me being reduced to a mindless object. I remembered her mocking smile when she told me to just sit there and be a pretty decor. She was about to learn a very painful lesson about the structural integrity of the ornaments she so casually dismissed. I casually opened my secure corporate email client and clicked to open a new draft window. I clicked on the attachment icon and navigated to the deeply hidden, encrypted partition on my hard drive. I selected the pristine, unalterable export file extracted directly from my decentralized shadow ledger. This file contained the absolute, undeniable truth, the exact timestamp, the specific Internet Protocol address, and the precise keystroke logs of Eleanor intentionally, manually overriding the federal block to secure her own bonus. In the recipient line, I did not bother typing out individual names. I used the global administrative mailing list to ensure maximum exposure. I populated the field with the entire board of directors, the chief legal officer, and, most crucially, the specific external email address for the lead investigator of the federal audit team who was currently standing just 50 feet away in our main lobby. I moved my cursor down to the subject line and typed carefully, "Emergency Report Quarter 4 Wind Project Incident." Eleanor was still raving, screaming about how my silence was an admission of guilt and incompetence. I ignored her entirely. I moved down to the main body of the email. I did not write a lengthy explanation, a defensive essay, or a plea for understanding. I did not need to. The attached blockchain ledger was an executioner's blade that spoke for itself. I placed my hands on the keyboard and typed exactly 5 cold, chilling English words. CFO manually bypassed federal compliance. I took a slow, deep breath, lifted my hands from the keyboard, and looked up from my screen. I locked eyes with Eleanor right at the exact moment she was drawing a breath to scream another vicious insult at me, maintaining an icy, unbroken stare into her terrified eyes. I reached out, grasped my mouse, and firmly clicked the send button. The fallout from my email was absolutely instantaneous. By 3 o'clock that exact same afternoon, the chairman of the board of directors had convened an emergency, mandatory disciplinary hearing in the very same grand boardroom where my invisible career had supposedly been cemented. It was a completely different atmosphere this time. The room was no longer filled with the arrogant laughter of untouchable executives. Instead, it was suffocating under the heavy, sterile presence of federal legal representatives and corporate defense attorneys. I sat calmly at the far end of the long mahogany table, watching the final act of this tragedy unfold. Eleanor Vance was completely unspooling, stripped of her power and facing the terrifying reality of federal indictment. She resorted to the oldest trick in the corporate playbook, playing the victim. She wept hysterically, tears streaming down her face and ruining her expensive makeup. She pointed a trembling, accusatory finger at me across the expanse of the room, wildly screaming that I was a malicious hacker. She claimed I had deliberately sabotaged the third-party software and fabricated the entire override sequence just to frame her out of petty jealousy. I let her finish her frantic, tearful performance. Then, without saying a single word, I stood up and connected my tablet to the primary presentation system. The massive projector screens behind the chairman flickered to life. I did not show a complex, easily manipulated spreadsheet. I displayed the raw, cryptographic export from my shadow ledger. The screen illuminated the dark room with undeniable, unalterable facts. In glaring white text, it displayed Eleanor's highly classified personal login credentials, the specific geographic Internet Protocol address directly tracing back to her corner office, and the precise timestamp of the exact moment she chose her $2 million bonus over federal law. It was checkmate. The blockchain could not be bullied, intimidated, or erased. But the absolute climax of the afternoon, the brilliant twist that I had not even fully anticipated, came directly from the lead representative of the federal audit team. He stood up, adjusted his glasses, and dropped a bombshell that sucked the remaining oxygen right out of the room. The catastrophic flaws in the wind turbine contract were not merely the result of Bryce Sterling being a careless, incompetent nepotism hire. The auditors had seized Bryce's personal communications and discovered a blatant, highly documented trail of collusion. Bryce had actively conspired to accept massive financial kickbacks from the offshore contractors in exchange for guaranteeing those illegal, inflated interest rates. The federal agent looked directly at Eleanor, whose face had turned the color of ash. By deliberately bypassing the federal warning and forcing the disbursement of those specific funds, Eleanor was no longer just facing a massive civil penalty for a compliance violation. She had officially facilitated the transfer of illicit funds, making her a direct criminal accomplice to federal bribery and wire fraud. The golden boy of Apex Meridian Capital broke down completely. Bryce Sterling collapsed entirely, burying his face in his hands and sobbing loudly, uncontrollably in the middle of the silent room as the terrifying reality of a lengthy federal prison sentence finally washed over him. Two armed corporate security guards stepped forward, physically flanked Eleanor, unceremoniously stripped the platinum security badge from her lapel, and escorted her out of the glass doors. The chairman of the board, a man who had never spoken a single word to me in my 6 years at the firm, turned his pale, trembling face in my direction. The arrogance was completely gone, replaced by pure, desperate terror. His empire was burning to the ground, and he suddenly realized that I was the only person who knew how the water hoses worked. His voice shook as he practically begged me to stay. He offered me the immediate title of Chief Compliance Officer. He promised to triple my current salary, offering me a massive signing bonus if I would just sit down and help them navigate the apocalyptic legal nightmare they had created. I slowly stood up from my chair. I took a moment to carefully smooth out the slight wrinkles in my tailored designer dress. I reached into my leather briefcase, pulled out a perfectly crisp, pre-signed letter of resignation, and placed it gently onto the heavy oak table. "A piece of pretty decor does not know how to clean up this kind of trash, sir," I said, my voice softer and lighter than it had been in years. I turned on my heel and walked toward the exit. I pushed open the heavy glass doors and stepped out into the hallway, leaving the smoldering ruins of Apex Meridian Capital behind me forever. Tomorrow morning, I would start my new position as Vice President of Risk Management at their biggest rival firm, and I had never felt more alive. Thank you so very much, dear listeners, for tuning in to the conclusion of today's story. We would love to know where you are listening from, so please drop your city or country in the comments below. If you found today's story satisfying and thrilling, please remember that our channel will no longer be uploading new videos in the coming future as we make our full transition to Patreon. Please help support our work by joining the Boss Revenge Stories Patreon community, where you can listen to our very best, exclusive, and completely true stories that are too intense to publish on YouTube. You can simply scan the Patreon QR code currently on your screen, or use the link provided in the description and the pinned comment below. Thank you for your incredible support, and we will see you over on Patreon.